Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Wiesenthal lecture. My name is Eva Kovács, and it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Hana Kubátová. Hana Kubátová is an assistant professor at the Czechs University and head of its Center for the Transdisciplinary Research of Violence, Trauma, and Justice. Hana has an interdisciplinary profile, and her areas of research include majority and minority relations, nationalism and nativism in the past and today, as well as the social history of the Holocaust. She holds degrees from both the Central European University and the Czechs University, be it from political studies, nationalist studies, and modern history. Hana has been a recipient of numerous fellowships and grants, including a Marie Curie Fellowship, a Charles Raison Foundation Fellowship from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, a Felix Posen Fellowship from the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism and Israel Government Scholarship, a Gisela Fleischmann Scholarship from the Milan Šimečka Foundation, and more recently, a Junior Core Fellowship from the Institute of Advanced Study, Central European University in Budapest. Hana has published in Slovak, Czech, German, Hungarian, and English, and her contributions have been accepted in numerous scholarly outlets, including the journal Nations and Nationalism, Contemporary European History, Holocaust Studies Journal of Culture and History, Jewish Studies Yearbook at the Central European University, and others. She has recently co-authored The Jews in Czech and Slovak Imagination between 1938 and 1989, Anti-Semitism, the Holocaust and Zionism in 2018, and in the same year, she also co-edited the book Jews and Gentiles in Central and Eastern Europe during the Holocaust, History and Memory. Her upcoming special issue of Eastern European Politics and Society, co-edited with Natalia Alexiun, explores biographies of belonging in the Holocaust. Hana is an executive committee member of the European Consortium for Political Research and a Holocaust Section Division co-chair for the Association for Jewish Studies. Her research interests include, as I mentioned, majority and minority relations in wartime and post-war Slovakia, local studies, identity construction, and microdynamics of ethnic violence. The title of her tonight lecture is Peasants, Elites, and Other Locals, the Making of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. Hana, welcome and thank you for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
In early December 1940, the newly appointed Minister of Home Affairs, Alexander Mach, left the capital Bratislava for an official visit of the Šariš Zemplín County in the eastern corner of Slovakia, or rather what was left of the country following first the November 1938 Vienna arbitration and the March 1939 Slovak-Hungarian War, and the subsequent Hungarian occupation of southern and southeastern regions. A leading figure of the radical wing within the Hlinka Slovak People's Party, the state party, Mach was said, in the words of the party's mouthpiece, Slovak, and I quote, to get to know the conditions in which people live in eastern Slovakia, end of quotation. Propaganda painted Mach's motivation as genuine, not political, they wrote, adding that the minister, and again a quotation, was not accompanied by political agitators, but doctors, cultural and social workers on his trip. The reality was, as always is, more complicated. Visiting 17 towns and villages across eastern Slovakia, Mach was aware of the uneven political support for the regime in this particular county. Some of it had to do, certainly, with the multi-ethnic structure of the region that I will come back to, But there was also a much wider crisis of trust that Mach was responding to. Here, as elsewhere in the country, in general, rather high popular support for the regime was undermined by chaotic governance, conflicts within the state party, prolonged supply problems, omnipresent corruption, bribery, and nepotism, but equally so by the inability of the regime to deliver on one of its core promises, to improve the socio-economic conditions of the ordinary people by them benefiting from the many now introduced anti-Jewish policies. Few months before Mach visited the county, Hitler actually summoned the Slovak leadership to Salzburg. Aware of the brewing conflicts within the party and afraid of the domestic tensions, the Nazis forced a reorganization of the Slovak government, giving more power to the radicals just like Mach, who served since 1939 as the chief commander of the paramilitary Hlinka Guard, and he kept this position until 1944. The July 1940 Slovak-German deliberations in Salzburg brought an incursion of the ideas and methods of National Socialism into governmental practice of the new Slovak Republic, which in turn was to bring new energy, as propaganda claimed, a real fast pace, once we had not been used to before, when feeding, a verb that they used, the people with Jewish property. Expectations for the regime ran particularly high in the Šariš Zemplín County, as this was the poorest region of Slovakia and one with the highest distribution of minorities, Jews, Roma included. Ever since receiving autonomy in October 1938 and declaring independence in March 1939, the Hlinka party officials made these bold proclamations about how the new order will bring new attention to the Šariš Zemplín County. They blamed Prague policies, the first Czechoslovak republic, for neglecting the East, and attributed all difficulties of the region to the Jew, who was said, and I quote, maintain a malign influence on the environment in which he lives. Eliminating regional disparities in general and uplifting the rural eastern parts of Slovakia in particular was not only something promised by the government, but it was also anticipated, even demanded, as I will show. Indeed, central bureaus in Bratislava were flooded with what one source called many complaints that the east of Slovakia thinks of itself as an orphan, neglected because of its distance from the capital. And what I also found interesting is that such complaints were not only openly voiced by district and local officials in their handling with the national administration, but were clear and visible in situational reports, in official papers, were captured by individual inhabitants of the region as well. With all this probably in mind, and surrounded, yes, by doctors, cultural and social workers, but also members of the clergy, and actually fellow party members, local officials, or, for instance, the newly appointed German advisor for the Hlinka Guard, Mach traveled through the county, giving these fiery speeches and promising that the government, as he claimed, I quote, is already and will continue in the future to do everything to satisfy the needs of the people. Among the many stops Mach made during those 2 quite busy days was a little town of Sečovce. In his hour-long speech, making a stop here, Mach advertised the manifold anti-Jewish policies the government adopted and repeated the government's signature propaganda claim, namely that actions against the Jews are to be taken as done on behalf of the majority Slovaks, now understood as an exclusive ethno-religious category. What the Jews lose, the Slovaks gain, is what was at the core of the argument made here, referring to the much more harsher so-called second Aryanization law that was enforced a month earlier in November 1940. Mach promised stronger actions against the Jews in the East, assuring the public that new governmental ordinances will finally and irreversibly purge Slovak villages from Jewish exploiters. Being aware probably of the strong role that religion and its institutions played in the lives of many villagers in the East, not only there, but also, Mach devoted significant attention also to bridging Christian values with the ideology of National Socialism. The official places even called it the introduction of a Slovak, or sometimes called Christian, National Socialism. Now, obviously, propaganda was clearly portraying a false picture about Mach having no political agenda when coming to the East, whether it was on this trip or any other trip he made. It is clear that Mach was evidently accompanied by political agitators, however we want to define these. But perhaps propaganda was right that Mach needed, even relied also on local elites, political, but so much more social, when making his case to the public. So if I stay in that small town of Sečovce, the minister was here, joined by a priest from a nearby town. So after Mach spoke, the priest took a stand, backed Mach's words, but he did more than that, using his religious authority, using perhaps also his popularity in the vicinity. He assured those that gathered to listen to the minister that, and I quote, "National Socialism is the highest divinity of God." There is a disjunction in scholarship my work responds to. And I believe that I myself have been partly faulty of this disjunction in my own scholarship. The existing scholarly literature on the wartime state and the Holocaust in Slovakia acknowledges that it was the decisions of the Slovak government that initiated and facilitated many of the anti-Jewish policies, including, but not only, the deportations of the 2/3 of country's pre-war Jewish population to their almost imminent death between March and October 1942. Now, yes, there is an ongoing debate. How do we measure, identify Slovak role in the latter developments during the German occupation of Slovakia? To what extent was Slovakia involved? To what extent was it able to control what was going on? But I think most historians, not nationalists, agree that the Slovak regime is responsible for what happened prior to 1944 and that it took initiative in many of the stands. There seems to be also a slow but still growing scholarly agreement on some form of popular complicity in the Holocaust. We have a growing number of works that are very detailed about Aryanization in particular towns, villages, that look at the Aryanization of Jewish businesses, the looting of Jewish land, that look at the liquidation of Jewish businesses, micro-historical studies that investigate who was able to participate, who had a bigger chance to obtain a Jewish property, and who less so. Well, meticulously researched, and many of these works are something that I build on. I feel that they very often assume unitary actors. as if on one hand investigating the higher ups, such as Mach, but most often, and it makes sense, the president priest Josef Tiso, and so much attention being placed on him as the leader, as a both religious and a secular figure, given his standing in the society. So that on one side, and then on the other side, the majority society, a growing number of works on the so-called ordinary people. But I do believe that if we historians, including myself, pose these two kind of groups against each other, that a number of questions still remain unanswered. And this is where I see perhaps my humble contribution, and this is where I try to position my recent work. So some of the questions that I believe are still open: what was the relationship between the center and the local, between the ideology and policies embraced at the top and choices taken on the ground? How much of what we see on the ground was a result of only statewide policies? How much of it was it influenced, for instance, by pre-existing conflicts? What, but also who, served as a vehicle for conformity and complicity in towns and villages away from the center, such as Czechs? Maybe to rephrase it, to what extent was it more important what the higher ups said, what Mach delivered, or was it important what the local priest added? As I already mentioned, I think even in my own previous works, in which I explored Jewish-Gentile relations in wartime and post-war Slovakia, I was puzzled, and I think I never completely answered of the dynamics of the Holocaust on the ground, if there is such a thing as to completely answer. I was struck by kind of Jews being denounced in many of these my micro-historical research, being denounced in one village but finding shelter, however temporary, in another, by the different ways communal exclusion was performed and made sense of in the local communities. But many of the Jewish witnesses, assigning their survival to the fact, not only to the locals, but also by whom the locals were influenced, what was the intelligentsia like, whether there was a Protestant or a Catholic priest, what were the teachers like, and such. I was similarly intrigued by some of the very kind of initiative county and district officials when it comes to introducing harsher and harsher anti-Jewish laws here in the East, often exceeding the expectations of the Bratislava administration. And sometimes it felt that Bratislava administration was saying, slow down, this is too much. So what does it say about the notion of Eastern Slovakia, as they sometimes presented themselves as well? A periphery, politically backward, disinterested in anything that does not really concern them directly, fully dependent on assistance, on help from people like Alexander Mach, dependent on imported ideas, notions, and even emotions. Approaching the Holocaust as a communal process, one that is orchestrated from above, but which also has an inherent local dynamics. My book project, and hopefully one day maybe turned into a book, examines how ideology was converted into choices, how policies were made sense of, at times rejected, but most certainly experienced among what I try to adopt an inclusive category of locals in Eastern Slovakia. Now, and I do so by looking at the negotiation of power and authority in the Slovak Eastern peripheries in the Holocaust. And of course, maybe I should make a remark that I'm positioning myself vis-a-vis some of the kind of literature on the Holocaust in Slovakia, but throughout my work, I have been inspired by wonderful research of many of those who are joining me here, Natalia, Alexandra Korb, but also others, Jan Grabowski, Tomáš Friedel, and others who have kind of explored, I think, these individuals within social structures and who have been an inspiration for my work. And to present what I am trying to do, I propose to do it two ways, to kind of lay out kind of the general framework of my research, to also kind of give you an idea of this topography of the Šariš Zemplín County, not only the physical environment, but also the relations between objects, people, and places within that particular space. And then kind of sketch out two lines of investigations that I follow. So looking at kind of the social elites, such as teachers, doctors, members of the clergy, and how they kind of contributed to communicating and performing at times anti-Jewish policies that came from above, but also how these kind of ideology and policies, even how the position of the local elites was made sense of, sometimes negotiated, discussed on the ground. So looking at communications between individuals, so kind of members of the ordinary people, locals, and party officials on the national level. And I will explain why I find it intriguing later on. As probably results from what I'm trying to say, or hopefully, my investigation is placed within the kind of Meso-Level, which is social science literature, and I am within a kind of a social science disciplines, is defined as focusing on what scholars call kind of subnational regions, communities, or specific institutions. And in here, in my work, I look at Meso-Level, or understand the Meso-Level research by taking the subnational region of the Šariš Zemplín County and positioning it vis-a-vis both the national administration, but also the people who lived in that particular county. And when looking at individuals, trying to position them within kind of social structures. Recent scholarship has proposed Meso-Level research as a way to overcome the tendency to interpret wars, but also genocides, including the making of the Holocaust, acontextually. And of course, I acknowledge that elite interactions, ideology, and strategies performed and articulated from above are important, but I believe that one needs to kind of take into account also communal elites on the ground, local fragmentations, but also social and gendered hierarchies, and that urban interactions should not be given preference over rural ones. And for me, the Šariš Zemplín County offers a useful playground for investigating the interplay between the decisions taken at the center and the situation on the ground. And I would like to support my argument with a few examples. And I also want to make a case why actually I believe that the rural parts and these peripheries are a good lens to investigate the Holocaust in Slovakia as such. Wartime Slovakia was a predominantly rural country. There is one argument, with most of the population employed in primary sector, again, meaning agriculture, forestry, and fishery. Compared to the Bohemian lands, the Slovaks like to compare themselves either to the Czechs or the Hungarians, the level of urbanization was much lower in Slovakia. Only 11% of the population in Slovakia lived in towns with over 10,000 inhabitants. And there were only 15 towns of this size in interwar Slovakia. So if you would compare it to the Bohemian lands, then there would be 65 towns of this size. Prior to 1945, sociologists and ethnographers depict Eastern Slovakia as characterized by chronic poverty, by poor educational provisions, by agricultural dependence, and by a very difficult and long-term problem of the East, and that is the emigration to North America. Poor living conditions were intensified by high unemployment, by almost zero industry, by unstable weather conditions, inadequate soil fertility, leaving the region and its people virtually dependent on assistance from the center. The vast majority of approximately 2.6 million inhabitants of pre-war Slovakia identified with one of the Christian churches, most notably with the Roman Catholic Church. While the territorial advances of Hungary against Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939 altered the ethnic structure of the republic, the Šariš Zemplín County remained the most ethnically diverse one, counting approximately 440,000 people in 1940 numbers. As I already said at the beginning, the county was home not only to majority Slovaks, but also minority Hungarians, Germans, Czechs, Ruthenians, and the largest Jewish and Roma population in Slovakia then. Besides being multi-ethnic, the Šariš Zemplín County was also largely multi-religious and or multi-denominational. While again, most identified with the Roman Catholic Church, significant sections of the population here align with one of the other Christian churches, most notably with the Greek Catholic Church. And of course, many identified with Judaism. There was also a large Hasidic community in the county itself. As mentioned briefly, the multi-religious and multi-ethnic character of the country was seen as contributing, if not causing, the uneven political support for the state party and hence also for the regime. So in what I do in my work, I look at individual stories and individual kind of trajectories of these local social elites, and I position them both within communities where the Hlinka party had a strong standing, that were more majority Slovak and Roman Catholic, vis-a-vis those where there was a sizable, for instance, Ruthenian minority, hence contributing to the less of a support to the Hlinka party. Already in the interwar years, of course, the kind of the inclusive character of what it means to be a local, and we have explored this with Monika Vrskulova in an article that will appear as part of the special issue that was mentioned in the introduction. The inclusive category of the local was in the East increasingly rejected. The Hlinka party became fixated on kind of the discrepancy between natural, as if ethnic, and political, as if state borders. Of course, Jews and Hungarians were the first and most obvious suspects, but there was also an increasing tension between the Roman Catholics and the Greek Catholics. Kind of the national awareness of Ruthenians became problematized in time. Markers of ethnicity and religious affiliation were seen as intertwined, and in many of the party bulletins, the Greek Catholics started to not be treated as Slovak enough. Where these kind of national tensions and the way the new order of Slovakia and the changing of kind of borders, but also changing of norms had an effect on the Šariš Zemplín County, was of course also on the kind of social composition within that particular county. So as elsewhere, and as typically the case, authoritarian turns are accompanied by political purges, giving headway to activists and social climbers. In the Slovak case, the 1939 turn was accompanied by an unimaginable previously social mobility in general. And there were a number of factors that contributed to this. Some of them I have already mentioned. Of course, the border changes, the removal of the Hungarians and the Hungarian-speaking minorities, the expulsion of more than 60,000 Czechs from the country in the first few months, many of them actually employed in administration, including in schools. And then, of course, the persecution of the Jewish minority, who was seen as having too big of a role in some of the professions, large sections. There was a sizable number of Jews, for instance, as doctors, also serving in eastern parts of Slovakia. The removal of the Czechs, Hungarians, and the various laws against the Jews made also way for a new ethnically Slovak middle class. But there are some factors to take into consideration and that once again complicate the story. Throughout wartime Slovakia, we know that with exception of the highest executive position, there was very little discontinuity when it comes to ruling and non-ruling social elites. So there was a big group of social and political elites that continued and stayed in their positions. Again, this can be explained by the fact that there was not a sizable enough Slovak minority or majority that would take part, that would benefit, that would have the qualifications to have these positions. Sources would claim that there were not enough specialized professionals suitable for these functions. Now, why is it important, I believe, is that in the peripheries of Slovakia especially, the central authorities were not the only with authority and power. And this is something that official places acknowledged and were aware of. So when we look at an ethnography of Slovakia from 1944, it says that in the villages and small towns, and I quote, the most influential individual was the priest, especially the Roman Catholic priest, and then the doctor, notary, or official, and the teacher. Now, pointing to local churches and local religious authorities demonstrates my point. Now, teachers and clergy were communal authorities, and again, as we have established with Monica, they were looked for guidance even on societal attitudes towards the official sanctioned Jewish question. When you either listen to the Slovak so-called bystanders to the Holocaust, children, relatives, or themselves former members of the kind of social elite, they often acknowledged their role in explaining what was going on to the general public. Anna Alžbeta Gulichova, who we quoted in our work, recalled the crucial role played by his father, a Greek Catholic priest, in rationalizing, explaining, perhaps a better word, the 1942 deportations. She recalled that people would come to the rectory and asked, why is this happening? What is going on? What does this mean? Now, of course, not to simplify, the institutions of the church played various roles. The institution as such was presented by President Priestiso, the church played its part in authorizing and ousting the Jews, but also some of the institutions of the church played a role of hiding places, especially in the last month of the war, with many local Jews finding rescue in rectories hidden behind the walls of covenants. When it comes to these local elites and their position vis-a-vis the majority society, but also vis-a-vis those in power, the national administration, on numerous occasions, these central places reminded the local intelligence of their responsibility vis-a-vis their communities and the regime as such. Indeed, mid-level positions entailed also informal tasks and duties, including educating the society about the new order. And they were to do their job within the job itself, as well as outside of it. Local elites social elites were expected to take role in the local administration, hence often crossing the boundaries between local and social. On many occasions, mid-level actors were expected to take on extra duties. Teachers were, for instance, since September 1940, required to participate in work for the Hlinka youth, subordinated to the party, and even in the paramilitary Hlinka Guard. There were a number of instances when you go over kind of official documents, but also press that was directed to notaries, to teachers, in which they say, and I have one quotation, we demand that civil servants be good helpers to our citizens. We expect a lot from notaries and teachers in the cultural and economic field. But it is not enough for us when a civil servant does nothing wrong. We demand positive good work. Now, very often, teachers, notaries, doctors, and officials understood kind of this part of the bargain, and they also used their position to advance their social standing. So, in a nearby small town of Sečovce in Michalovce, there was an instance when there was a power struggle within who gets a particular apartment formerly owned by the Jews in their holding. And I think because of the connections that the social elites were able to make, this was made public, and the mouthpiece of the more radical party, the Hlinka Guard, made this also one of their issues, and were informing the public and hence also informing the authorities that there is a local teacher in Michalovce who wants to get an apartment but is not able to do so, and he does everything correctly. You know, he is fulfilling important duties in his position as a teacher. So coming back to Alexander Mach and his visit to Eastern Slovakia, Minister Mach promised that the adoption of this Christian National Socialism would bring a new fast pace in solving the Jewish question, and that this would bring great things to the majority Slovaks, as he said. So we know that on August 2nd, 1940, the government issued a number of ordinances already. Others quickly followed. Weapons, typewriters, automobiles, cameras were confiscated. Jews were forbidden to employ Aryans younger than 40 years of age. Then we heard, or I mentioned already, about the second Aryanization law introduced in November 1940, who abolished this kind of voluntary contract, however difficult the term is to be applied in this context, of course. For the many men and women of Sečovce, similarly to inhabitants of other towns and villages across the country, the government's invitation to kind of participate in solving the Jewish question in their particular community was a temptation they could not resist. In Czechs itself, around this period, 200 new members joined the Hlinka party. Another bunch of people also joined the Hlinka Guard, kind of securing their loyalty to the regime. But it is not only that locals participated in something that was offered to them. But when reviewing communications that individuals had with the district, but also national administration, it seems that they not only listened to what Mach was saying, but that they actually heard what he was telling them. Many even dared to approach the minister directly. So maybe taking into consideration this kind of the chaotic system of government in wartime Slovakia, these communications are to be taken as a way of bargaining, negotiating over power and authority. So a few examples. In August 1940, Mach receives a letter from an employee of a local school in Michalovce, a town in the vicinity of Sečovce that I already mentioned. His name is Jan Smiško. Smiško criticizes the Aryanization process, that it only feeds the upper class in his hometown. He clearly saw this as both unhealthy and unfair, and bluntly asks, and I quote, "Wouldn't also the poor people like to take over these businesses?" End of quotation. He and many others were clearly putting faith in Mach, sidestepping the local administration. Smiško even told Mach, in another quotation from the letter, "People are waiting, but they need actual businesses, not promises." In the midst of the first deportation wave, and we again have to take into consideration that in the first deportation wave from March until October 1942, the first in line were the Jews of Eastern Slovakia, including Jews from many of these small towns and villages. Mach receives another bunch of letters from the small towns that I'm looking at. In one of the letters, signed by Pavel Dubek, and I wrote about him in some of my earlier works, he writes that he requests from Minister Mach that the Jews disappear. Another case from the same small town of Sečovce, Michal Havrila writes, "A radical cut with the Jews was expected, especially in the East, but we were disappointed. Not one of those Jews who should be in the camps is there." In a further anonymous now letter written to Alexander Mach, the writer accuses a fellow countryman of, and I quote, "un-Slovak, un-our, unpatriotic behavior." The man whom the letter writer identified by both his name and occupation allegedly was a guardian of the Jews, received valuable things from them. This man was accused of being under Jewish influence, of helping Jews to hide their belongings, conducting business with them. In return, according to this letter writer, the Jews helped him avoid military service by bribing the authorities. The accuser, as he called himself, needed to remain anonymous because he was afraid of the local administration, because they were under their, that is, Jewish influence. And similarly to those before him, also this writer requests prompt action from the minister. And he writes, "You will agree with me when you read this, Mr. Minister. It is immoral and unjust, and I respectfully asked you, I want to say, if you could, based on your conscience and fair decision, intervene immediately and order a swift correction." Now, it is not only that men complained to authorities and bargained over them becoming the new economic elite of those particular town. Women often approach Slovak politicians, or rather the wives of Slovak politicians as well. A number of women approached the wife of Alexander Mach as well, including a 23-year-old administrative assistant, an official of the town, who kind of listened to Mach saying that the new regime will give to poor people. And she writes to Mach's wife, "I hear that they are taking many things from the Jews nowadays, and I'm sure this includes women's suits, underwear, and coats. And I would like to ask you to take something of this kind from one rich Jewish woman and give it to a poor and brave clerk who will appreciate this greatly and forever pray for the humanitarian who helped save her from the poverty." Now, what I'm arguing is that these communications should not be read only as a manifestation of loyalty to the regime itself, to the party or ideology, because they clearly kind of picked the addressee of their petition to maximize their chances. They interspersed their letters with anti-Jewish statements, often statements that were earlier repeated in the newspapers or on radios. Though they were made abstract claims, they were not shy away from letting the authorities know that they are kind of bargaining over their share of the loot. They were informing on the district officials. They were informing on those that had, according to their opinion, not done their work appropriately. And if they would not react, some of these writers were even say that they would go further. And if the national administration would not interfere in what is happening in that particular district, they would go to the Germans. In the midst of all this, what was going on, most of Mach's promises were never fulfilled. The Aryanization remained one of the most corrupt enterprises of the Slovak state, and probably was a reason why the popular support for the regime declined. But there was, from the perspective of this withdrawn category of Slovaks, the town itself was thriving. The economy was booming, diminishing the problem of the East unemployment. That particular town, in the summer of 1939, Czechs opened their first swimming pool. Its annual harvest celebration turned the little town into a center of the county. By 1942, for the first time, the town built its first public pavements, remodeled its main square and a nearby park, completed the construction of a new post office, and had enough funds to settle all the town's debts. Taking a model approach to the redistribution of power in the new republic, the town received appraisal of the radicals. The mouthpiece of the Hlinka Guard, the Gardista, presented the little town of Sečovce as a model town. It is here where people take full advantage of the new order. So coming to conclusion, whereas the exclusion of Jews in Slovakia was clearly orchestrated from above, be it the Germans, but very much so the Slovak national administration. The communal exclusion was done with the assistance of the local elites, political, but also social. And the social death of the Jews was done in public display, with broad popular involvement. Streets, schools, the main square, the rectory, the border, but also the doctor's office, the official places. It is where the bonds of the community were fostered, but in this case also broken. So in my investigation, my retake on the making of the Holocaust and looking at the perspective from the perspective of the Šariš Zemplín County, I believe that to understand the making of the Holocaust, one should not only look at the kind of political dimension on the ideologies and policies of the clerical fascist regime, however important they were, but one has to take into consideration also the geographical dimension, the border disputes, the changes, but also the social or societal dimension in which lives of Jews was entangled with the choices and actions of their Gentile neighbors, and in which these choices were not only imported from above, but had a local dynamics on itself. And to understand it, one has to also include the local and social elites, as well as how the locals bargained over their share with both those higher ups, whether these were on the district or national level. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Hana, for this insightful analysis of your work in progress. I felt myself in a kind of time machine, traveling back to Šariš, and I have many questions, but I think Natalia was the first. She sent a message, and I will invite Natalia as a panelist. And then we will have a lively discussion, and I will do the same with all of you if you want. So we have two possibilities. First possibility is to send your questions in the chat box. But if you want to ask directly, we can invite you, and then you can start to discuss it with Hana. So Natalia, it's nice to see you again. The floor is yours.
Nice to see you and wonderful to hear both. And thank you, Hana, for this intellectual treat. And I wish we could, after this lecture, go for some strudel and coffee. But I have a lot of, it was really a full meal. But let me start with 3 questions. One is very predictable. I was puzzled by the women's suits. And I wonder what happens when you plug gender into this story, and more specifically, are these local elites primarily male? Am I guessing right? But if there are women who have some role in setting the tone, who are they and how does this happen? Does it happen through their men, etc., etc.? Second, about these local elites, is there internal hierarchy among them, and how is this hierarchy organized? Is it still like among clergy, for example, Catholic priests come before Greek Orthodox clergy, etc.? And then I'm very interested in this whole idea about reading closely the communications in their diverse functions. I think it's brilliant. I wonder if there is also communication on this Meso-level that you can trace, not only from local officials up, but among themselves, understanding what's going on. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalia. This was all of your 3 questions, or do you have 2 more? Okay. Okay, Hana.
Thank you very much. It's always such a treat to receive a question from Natalia, because it pushes you to rethink what you have been doing for many of the months before. So these are all important questions, and I will try to kind of provide some answer, although I'm sure that many of the things then will come to my mind after I stop speaking. So about kind of gender roles, the thing that, for instance, I'm looking at is there was a big proportion of women as teachers, but already during the first Czechoslovak Republic and later on, they were expected once they would get married to leave their positions. And I think this was something that was quite articulated and debate even within the press. So there has been some recent works on women during the Slovak state, and they have looked particularly at teachers and how they used their journals to voice their dissent towards them being now their activities being redirected only to the private space. But in many of the cases, and this is also perhaps something that I'm struggling how to interpret it correctly, is they would act on behalf of their husbands who would be officials. So if the husband would be an official, he would formally not be allowed to take part in the Aryanization process, and very often their wives would do this on their behalf. So they would craft the letters, and of course then there is a question to what extent is what we are reading a communication from the woman, or to what extent is there a different hierarchy and dynamic behind the communication as well. But I think where women were more independent is when they approached female representatives, meaning wives of officials who were also seen as social elites within the party. Internal hierarchy, that is also important, and that is also something that I think I have to rethink about these communications that I have been so much following, how they and why they are so eager to kind of come in and very almost aggressively debate their point with one of the most feared radicals, such as Alexander Mach, to tell him, we demand this from you, or we will go to the Germans. And but in terms of, I think, internal hierarchy, one that is clear and obvious isn't the ethno-religious one. Yes, kind of the Roman Catholics are above all, and this is also something that, once again, I think in the Šariš Zemplín County is quite openly debated, because there are these large sections of the society who feel themselves kind of neglected, and they're not aligning themselves with the Jews, but they're saying, kind of, come on, see also us. And these are both the Protestants in the central Slovakia, but here particularly the Greek Catholics, and they are over and over kind of repeatedly seen as Hungarians, as not Slovak enough. They try to prove their loyalty. They sometimes change names from Hungarian to Slovak sounding, but it remains a power struggle, and I think it contributes to the fact that the regime was never strong in some of these towns and villages, and in the situation reports, I think one thing that I find also fascinating is that they were quite open about their dissatisfaction. So they kind of were saying, we are Slovaks, this is, we're not treated as equals. And this was quite visible in it. And although kind of on the national level, this was demeaned, and the newspapers would say, we are united in being Slovaks. This was not this was not the case. Was there another question?
Thank you, Hana. The next one is Alexander Korb and then Robert Rosette. Alexander?
Yeah, thank you so much, Hana. It was really beautiful in itself, but also because it triggers so many sort of question thinking about broader Europe and how it connects to other countries and how it compares. And so my question is, it seems a little bit maybe trivial, but actually I mean it from my heart. So if you look at Slovakia, the country is sort of relatively normal compared to other other countries that compare that engage very actively in genocide, like Romania or Croatia. And so it's a bit more like Hungary or Bulgaria. And so I think like confiscating typewriters or accusing people of anti-Slovak behavior is one thing, but actively killing people is another thing. And so I'm wondering about the mindset of people like the radicals like Mach, but also like the more moderate ones, if you will, like Tiso. Are they actually okay with killing people? And what do they know? What do they want? And where is their moral boundaries? And because normally I think Holocaust studies has the wrong tendencies to kind of have a very clear picture. Well, they were all complicit and they were all knowing what they were doing, and killing was the aim of those people. And sometimes I'm not so sure where the individual really stands when it comes to these questions. And it has to do with the lack of sources, because sometimes we simply don't know what exactly did they know. Did they really know that the people they govern are killed by poison gas 3 weeks after the deportation? So I'm not questioning it, of course, but still I think we need to raise that question anyway. And so the Slovak case, I think, is a fascinating one, especially because of its proximity to Auschwitz.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if I would counter-argue, I feel that Slovakia sometimes like to position itself of being kind of the heaven on earth during World War II. And of course, I'm not making comparisons that the situation in Slovakia was same or similar as in Eastern Galicia during the war. That's why I'm also referring to communal exclusion, not communal violence, as perhaps Natalia and Omar Bartov and Jan Gross-Grabowski would do. I acknowledge the differences, but I also feel that there was a complicity, local complicity, in terms of first, in the first wave, the kind of empowerment of the Jews had effect that these were ghettoized and deported from their communities, that there was a link between the positions being taken from the Jews, and that it, destroyed the communal bonds within that community that existed. If the violence happened within Slovakia or outside of its borders. But then again, I would also counter-argue about the violence effect. Now, by 1944, Slovakia is rather peaceful, but after 1944, and again, I don't want to make comparisons, but Eastern Slovakia becomes a rather violent part of the country. After the occupation, most of the atrocities that happen in the eastern corner of the country. Even in the post-war, the more known is the Topolčany pogrom, but the most violent pogrom was in Kolbasov, near the towns that I'm looking at. There were whole villages destroyed in 1944 and 1945, and I think that this adds to, and I didn't have time to dwell on the 1944 and 1945 here, so I stopped before kind of speaking about the German occupation, but I would maybe counter-argue that Slovakia, the wartime period in the Slovak history was dynamic, and the situation after 1944 is significantly more violent. Again, not making any comparisons, but hopefully making my case.
Thank you, Hana. Robert.
Hana, thank you. I'm not sure if we've ever met, but what I will do is invite you to meet us at Yad Vashem sometime. I think we'd be very happy to have you there. I have a question and I don't know, a question comment, I'm not sure which. To what extent do you think that there's a shifting of norms that happens because of the center? The center adopts policies, and then people in the periphery realize that certain behaviors become acceptable. And that opens up, kind of a window or a box or something, like Pandora's box opening up, that then all kinds of other behaviors, even beyond, can come out. That is that part of a dynamic you see? And then my other question is about, you talked about the breaking of the social bonds, and it's my impression, but of course it's more of an impression than anything else, that often those social bonds were just a very thin veneer, that they weren't very strong to begin with, because the shift towards persecuting Jews and then asking for their property it just seems there's very seamless. So it doesn't seem like it's a big break that's going on. So again, that's sort of a comment, but I also wonder if you observe that, if that makes sense to you or not. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions and for the invitations. And I would maybe respond to you by also referencing Yad Vashem archives, because I do agree with, yes, I believe that the social norms were moved because of the regime in power and because of what was happening on the national level. And I think the authority of people like Joseph Tiso was major, and although he might be not guilty in a legal sense in some aspects, he was certainly responsible for the Holocaust, and not only responsible because he was a president, but so much more because he was also a religious authority to many of these people. But I think the way how the Holocaust played itself out in those particular communities also depended on the kind of local elites that lived there. So just, I think this week I was reading materials from the Yad Vashem competition from the mid-1950s. And there is a testimony of a Slovak survivor who writes her testimony, and she's also from Eastern Slovakia. Then she goes into hiding and explains to Yad Vashem why she was able to survive in particular villages and why she has moved from other villages. And the point that she's making is that this very much differed on those kind of, not who was the kind of district official, but what was the atmosphere in the town. And she makes this connection when this was a evangelic, a Protestant town. Here the teacher was very nice. We were able to, he was a big authority. We felt safe in that particular community. So one thing maybe that also led me to kind of investigate how these local communities, what was their role and what big of a power and authority had, is by the testimonies with witnesses who acknowledge or identify the role of these local elites in them being saved. Not necessarily always the only one, but I think there is not enough attention being placed to these dynamics on the ground. So what is it that when an order comes, especially in this very chaotic, very corrupt government where everybody seems to know everybody? There is always a wife and a brother somewhere. Most join the Hlinka party. There seems to be a number of ways to go around. This is also something that becomes kind of verbalized throughout the wartime state as a problem. And I think Eastern Slovakia is a good example to kind of investigate this. But in short, I do believe that the norms were shifted because of the nationwide shift. And the second question was about
Yes. As I asked you, I said it was a half comment, half question about that those bonds were broken. The social bonds often seem to me to be very light to begin with, and that's why they're broken often.
That is an important point, and I was not trying to make a case that there was a love story before, and of course there is a wide scholarship that speaks about the Slovak-Jewish tensions in the 19th century, the role that the Jew plays in some of the Slovak tropes, with the Slovak national consciousness as the one who brought a Magyarization or alcohol to the Eastern Slovak villages, an innkeeper responsible for the deaths of the people. So I'm not trying to kind of romanticize, but I felt that the community was more inclusive in a sense that they were living close to each other, apart but close to each other, and that even maybe these vague bonds were broken, and were broken with the role of some of the religious authorities as well, who now started to kind of use their religious standing, as is in the case of the Stropkov priest, to advocate what is going on. And I think that is what I'm trying to make.
Thank you. Miriam has a question, as I recognized.
Yeah, thank you so much from me as well for these really fascinating insights into your research. And as you have mentioned several times, there was a multi-ethnic population and also including a large Roma population, right? So following the dynamics of the Holocaust on the ground, as you have put it, I would be just really interested to hear more about the Roma perspective, actually, and was hoping I could nudge you into saying a few words, and maybe also how you would position these intersections of discrimination in this social microcosm that you're exploring here. Thanks.
Oh, that is a very important nudge, and I feel guilty whenever I'm speaking with some of my very good friends that I should be more careful also when I speak about integrative history, of being also more careful and inclusive when it comes to other victims of the Slovak state, including the Roma, which are still being ostracized in the Slovak Republic. And I think the difference was, and there are many reasons why they should be included. Sečovce is a good example. There was a large Roma community from early on. Today, in Sečovce itself, one of the biggest ghetto itself, Roma ghetto is in Sečovce. It has become a Slovak Roma city. And I think where the difference comes is that they would be very often living at the outskirts of the towns from early on. And this is also how they were perceived, not as part of the Slovak community. And during World War II, they were also not seen as something that the Slovaks, meaning kind of the majority, the ethno-religious category for this purpose of this talk, that they would be able to gain something out of the Roma question. So I think they were ostracized, they were further kind of diminished in terms of their social standing within the society, but they rarely come up in the communications, which I don't think is a sign that they would be treated more lightly, but it's a sign that they were not seen as something that the Slovaks should care about or talk about. So if, for instance, in many of these towns in 1942, there was some kind of a communication about the deportations of Jews, we at least kind of see instances of people reporting some kind of emotions when it comes to the destruction of the communities. We don't see that with the situation of the Roma.
I also have a question because I know this region a bit, and so I just wonder how we can describe the asynchronities of the neighborhoods with the persecution of Jews and Roma, because as you beautifully described, what happened in 41, 42 in Šariš, and 30 kilometers from the south, it was a new Hungarian government there, but they were the same families, neighborhoods, social networks, etc. So I think maybe you could use this external observation of the same neighborhoods following the developments, what is happening in the new Slovak state. Meanwhile, in the new Hungarian state, in southeastern Slovakia, everything is still silent. Not everything, of course, because the second anti-Jewish law, the third anti-Jewish law, so all of the discriminations were of course introduced in the occupied part of Slovakia as well. But on the other hand, I cannot imagine this communication, but it would be great to find some sources because I think these regions communicated with each other because of the friendships, neighborhoods, Jewish communities, etc. And my second question is maybe childish. Does it make a sense to think about it that they are hill regions with a different culture as the big cities on the Platte? So they are really mountain communities. Does it play a role in the reactions and in the mode of integration, the communication culture, etc., that they have this long tradition living in within the mountains and having another culture?
Excellent questions, and I should have, I think, addressed the first. It was also something that once again we have explored with Monica in our article on biographies of belonging in the East, because I think what is fascinating about this particular region is that it complicates also the notion of the border, which is not part of my book, but I felt quite fascinated by it while working on that article. Because many times the families were broken, and they would spend, part of the family would be on what remained the Slovak side, while the other part remained on the now Hungarian side. But they were also so the family experience is very different after the war. And where do you integrate their narratives? I feel that they are very often left out from both of the communities, but also, and this is also where the officials come in, is that the Jews would cross the borders based on this, if this was possible, and if they had local connections from the Slovak or Hungarian officials, they would cross the border repeatedly in some instances, depending on where they felt it was safer for them to be. So in many sense, I think, and I would need a better Hungarian speaker, I think there were these communications in terms of crossing, in terms of many from the Eastern Slovakia surviving the war in Budapest. And they would be speaking about, now they come from these little towns, what I'm going to do in this big city. And they would speak about actually meeting somebody that they knew in that particular town. So there were many communications of actual, but also these metaphorical, in that people would cross the border. And what we today see as kind of a Slovak history of the Holocaust and a Hungarian history of the Holocaust is way more complicated and should be made more complicated in the East. And the second question about the mountains, I think what plays a role is also kind of the distance from that this region had. So I was now with a friend of mine who is kind of an expert on trains and communications, looking for how much would the tickets cost, how would you get to certain regions, how long it would take you, and perhaps also kind of this periphery was also something that was kind of felt because this is where kind of people lived, but very often stayed, and their communication with those who emigrated rather than those who lived in other parts of the town. I felt that there was a paradoxically maybe wider in some families communication with those who emigrated to the United States than information about what was going on in Bratislava. Perhaps it also has to do with what they perceived as the capital. It might also be the case, but for them the capital kind of imaginatively was Bratislava or Budapest. But there is also something kind of important to notice.
The next one is Martin Pekar. Martin, it's okay if you are here in the group and you can ask Hana directly, or it would be better if I read. No, nice. Hi.
I think I don't have any question or something like this. I just would like to thank Hana, and I just add some small comment that the Roma question was perceived as a regional problem of Eastern Slovakia until 1944. So that's just small comment to Miriam. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would you like to react, Hana?
Well, that is a good comment. Thank you for that. I do have to work on kind of integrating the Roma voices more into that story that I'm trying to write, and I'm aware of that. But also thanks to Martin Pekar, whose works on Šariš Zemplín County I rely on in my research.
So do we have more questions or comments? Miriam, please help me. I don't see. And
I don't see any either, Eva.
all right. Natalia, would you like to add something or? Okay. No, it's fine. It's fine. I didn't really.
I would, but I actually have a doctoral defense in 2 minutes, so I will stop myself until the next opportunity. But thank you very much.
Yes, it was again extremely inspiring. So I very much look forward to read this book, Hana, because it also shows our difficulties with methodologies, with sources, with imaginations, with languages, and we hardly ever discuss it in depth, how we can deal with these type of difficulties, which just struggle alone in the libraries and the archives. And I think it was also great that you shown us how difficult it is to make a real picture with the pieces of the puzzle, and it's an extremely complicated region, of course. So I don't know whether we can find another region which has such a difficult position in this history of Central Europe. Maybe not so much. So thank you very much, and thank you all of you that you took part in this beautiful discussion. We learned a lot again, and we will see you soon in another occasion in the next Simon Wiesenthal lecture.
Thank you.
Hana. Thanks. Bye-bye.